Imagine you're an Indian prince in 1757. Your kingdom has existed for centuries. You command armies of thousands. You control wealthy territories, and you consider yourself the equal of any ruler in the world. And then a private company, not even a government, just a trading corporation based in London, defeats your army at the Battle of Plassey. And here's the really disturbing part. They didn't defeat you primarily through superior numbers or even superior tactics. They defeated you because they could borrow money more cheaply than you could, because they had access to financial markets that could fund military operations at interest rates you couldn't match, and because they understood something you didn't, that in the modern world, financial power translates directly into military power, and military power creates opportunities for profit that justify the financial investment, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of conquest, extraction, and reinvestment that would eventually give Britain control over a quarter of the world's land surface and population. In this story, the story of how the British Empire was built not primarily through military genius or industrial superiority, but through financial innovation combined with ruthless willingness to use violence to enforce debt collection and secure profitable monopolies, is one of the most important and least understood stories in world history, because it reveals how the modern global economy was created through a marriage of finance and force, how capital markets and military power reinforced each other to create unprecedented wealth extraction and geographic control, and how the empire that claimed to bring civilization and progress was actually a sophisticated machine for transferring wealth from colonized populations to British investors. And understanding this isn't about assigning moral blame to people living today. It's about honestly confronting how the modern economic world was built, why global wealth is distributed the way it is, and how financial systems and military power interact to create and maintain inequality. Let's start with the basics of how this system actually worked, because the British Empire wasn't built by the British government, at least not initially. It was built by private companies, particularly the East India Company, which was chartered in 1600 as a trading corporation, but which eventually became a territorial power controlling most of India. And the mechanism was simple in principle, but sophisticated in execution. The company would borrow money from investors in London, promising to repay with interest. It would use that money to finance military operations, trade expeditions, and administrative structures in colonized territories. It would extract resources, establish monopolies, and collect taxes from conquered populations, and it would use those revenues to repay investors and to finance further expansion, and as long as returns exceeded the cost of borrowing, the system could grow indefinitely, and the returns were staggering, because the company wasn't operating in a free market. It was using military force to create monopolies, to fix prices, to extract tribute, and to eliminate competition. So profitability was essentially guaranteed by the British guns that enforced company rules. The financial innovation that made this possible was the development of sophisticated capital markets in London. By the early 1700s, Britain had created a system where the government could borrow enormous sums at relatively low interest rates, around 3 to 4%, by issuing bonds that could be traded on secondary markets. And this system, which grew out of the financial revolution following the Glorious Revolution of 1688, gave Britain an enormous advantage over rivals. France could borrow, but at higher rates, around 7 to 9%, because French government finances were less trusted and French capital markets less developed, and non-European powers like Mughal India or Qing China had even less access to capital markets. They could tax, and they could confiscate wealth, but they couldn't efficiently mobilize future revenues through borrowing in the way Britain could. So Britain could spend money it didn't yet have, could finance wars and expansion on credit, knowing that future profits and taxes would eventually pay back the loans. And this gave British forces the ability to sustain operations, to reinforce defeats, to outlast opponents who might win battles, but couldn't afford prolonged conflicts. The East India Company took this financial model and applied it to imperial expansion. The company could issue shares and bonds in London, raising capital from thousands of investors who were betting on the company's ability to generate profits from Asian trade and conquest. And these investors weren't necessarily supporting imperialism for ideological reasons. They were investing for profit. And the company's structure meant that risks were spread across many investors while profits, when they materialized, were substantial. And this created a constituency in Britain thousands of middle-class and wealthy investors who had financial interest in the company's success and who would pressure government to support company operations. So even though the East India Company was private, it had the backing of the British state when needed because so many influential people had money invested in its success. And this merger of private profit-seeking and state power created a uniquely effective imperial machine. Let's look at specific examples of how loans and gunpowder work together. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 is perfect because it's when the East India Company transformed from a trading operation into a territorial power. Robert Clive, leading company forces, faced the Nawab of Bengal's much larger army. But Clive had several advantages. He had access to credit that allowed him to pay his soldiers reliably. He had artillery and disciplined infantry that could defeat larger but less organized forces, and crucially, he had bribed several of the Nawab's key commanders to defect or remain neutral. And where did the money for these bribes come from? Loans from London and Bengal. The company was already deeply in debt, but it could borrow more because investors believed in future profits. And after Plassey, the company gained control of Bengal, one of the richest regions in the world, and immediately extracted enormous wealth through taxation. And these revenues allowed the company to repay debts, to reward investors, and to finance further expansion. So the battle itself was won through gunpowder and bribery, but the ability to field forces and pay bribes came from access to credit, and the justification for all the borrowing was the wealth that conquest would unlock. The revenues the company extracted from Bengal were staggering. Within a few years of taking control, the company was collecting somewhere around £3 million annually in land taxes from Bengal, which was comparable to the entire revenue of many European kingdoms. And this money didn't stay in India. Most of it flowed back to Britain, paying dividends to shareholders, funding further company operations, and enriching the individuals involved. And this extraction was enforced through violence and the threat of violence. When populations resisted taxation, company troops suppressed them. When merchants tried to evade company monopolies, they were punished. And when rival powers challenged company control, they were defeated through military force financed by the very revenues being extracted. So you had this perfect loop. Conquest generated revenues. Revenues funded military forces. Military forces enabled further conquest and secured revenue extraction, and all of it was justified to investors and the British public as bringing order, civilization, and free trade to benighted lands, even though the reality was monopoly, extraction, and coercion. The relationship between debt and empire becomes even clearer when we look at how the British government eventually took direct control of India from the company, because by the mid-1800s, the East India Company was simultaneously immensely profitable and deeply in debt. It had borrowed enormous sums to finance expansion and administration, and when the Indian Rebellion of 1857 occurred, the company had to borrow even more to suppress it, and eventually the debt burden became unsustainable. So, in 1858, the British government took over direct rule of India, but here's the key point. The government assumed the company's debts, and those debts were repaid using Indian tax revenues. So Indians were essentially paying for the costs of their own conquest and occupation. The loans that financed British expansion into India were repaid by taxing Indians, and this pattern, where colonized populations paid for their own colonization, was repeated across the empire. The gunpowder side of the equation was crucial because financial power alone doesn't create empires. You need the ability and willingness to use violence. And the British were both able and willing. The Industrial Revolution gave Britain advantages in weapons manufacturing. British firearms, artillery, and later machine guns were superior to what most non-European armies possessed. And British military organization, with disciplined professional soldiers and effective logistics, multiplied these technological advantages. But technological superiority alone doesn't explain British success, because in many battles, British forces were outnumbered, sometimes drastically. What made the difference was the combination of technology, organization, and most importantly, the financial capacity to sustain operations. British forces could lose battles and return reinforced, could maintain garrisons in distant territories, could pay soldiers reliably and supply them consistently, and all of this required money. And that money came from borrowing and from the extraction of wealth from colonized territories. The process of imperial expansion followed a consistent pattern across different regions. British traders would establish commercial presence, often gaining permission from local rulers who didn't initially understand the threat. British forces would intervene in local conflicts, backing one side against another and demanding concessions in exchange for support. These conflicts would provide pretext for further British involvement and eventual annexation. And throughout this process, every step was financed through borrowing that would be repaid through future extraction, and every step involved violence or the threat of violence. So the empire expanded through a combination of financial leverage and military force, each reinforcing the other, and local populations often found themselves in impossible situations, resist and face military destruction, or cooperate and become subordinate to a system designed to extract wealth for British benefit. The impact on colonized economies was devastating and deliberate. The British didn't just extract existing wealth. They restructured entire economies to serve imperial interests. In India, the company and later the colonial government destroyed existing textile manufacturing to eliminate competition with British factories. Weavers who had produced some of the finest cloth in the world were put out of business by cheap machine-made British textiles, and India went from being a major exporter of manufactured goods to being an exporter of raw cotton and an importer of British cloth. This deindustrialization was enforced through tariffs, through trade regulations, and ultimately through British control of Indian ports and customs, and it impoverished millions while enriching British manufacturers and merchants. Similarly, in other colonies, local economies were restructured to produce raw materials for British industry and to consume British manufactured goods, creating dependency relationships that persisted long after formal colonization ended. The human cost of this system is almost impossible to calculate, but was certainly enormous. Famines in British India killed tens of millions of people, not because of lack of food, but because of economic policies that prioritized exports and debt repayment over feeding local populations. The Bengal famine of 1770, just a few years after the company took control, killed approximately one-third of Bengal's population, around 10 million people, and this wasn't a natural disaster. It was a consequence of company policies that prioritized revenue extraction over welfare, and similar famines occurred repeatedly throughout British rule in India, with the policies often remaining unchanged because British officials prioritized maintaining revenue flows to repay debts and fund further expansion. So the loans that financed empire were repaid partly through deliberately induced starvation of colonized populations, which is a brutally honest way of describing what happened but is supported by historical evidence and contemporary accounts. The wealth that flowed to Britain through this system was transformative. Britain went from being a relatively minor European power in 1600 to the world's dominant power by 1900, and this transformation was financed substantially by colonial extraction. The capital that funded the Industrial Revolution came partly from colonial profits. The markets that British industry needed were created through colonial control. The raw materials that British factories processed came increasingly from colonies, and the investment opportunities that generated returns for British savers and investors were often in colonial enterprises. So British prosperity, British power, British global dominance, all of these were built substantially on the foundation of loans that financed conquest and gunpowder that enforced extraction. And this isn't a fringe historical interpretation. Mainstream economic historians increasingly recognize the centrality of colonial extraction to British development and the global economy. The role of racism and racial ideology in this system deserves careful attention, because the violence and exploitation required some justification beyond simple profit-seeking. You can't tell investors that you're stealing from people at gunpoint. You need a narrative that makes the violence seem necessary and even benevolent. And this is where racism became functionally important. The ideology that non-European peoples were inferior, that they needed European guidance and civilization, that they were incapable of self-government. These racist beliefs provided moral cover for a system of extraction and violence. And these beliefs were reinforced by everything from scientific racism to popular culture to educational systems. And they persisted long after formal colonization ended, shaping global racial hierarchies that continue today. So racism wasn't just a byproduct of empire. It was structurally necessary for empire to function, because without racist ideology, the violence and exploitation would have been harder to justify to domestic populations and to international audiences. The financial structures created by empire also shaped modern global finance. The institutions developed to manage imperial loans and trade became the foundations of modern international banking. Practices like currency manipulation, debt enforcement, and structural adjustment policies that developing countries face today have direct precedence in colonial financial practices. And the power dynamics, where wealthy countries and international financial institutions dictate terms to poorer countries, echo the relationships established during formal empire, so decolonization, while politically significant, didn't fully dismantle the economic structures of empire. Many of the relationships, dependencies, and power imbalances persist in modified forms, and understanding the historical roots of these structures is crucial for understanding contemporary global inequality. The process of decolonization itself reveals the continuing importance of financial power, because most colonies gained independence through political processes, but economic independence was much harder to achieve. Newly independent countries often inherited debts from colonial administrations, were economically structured to serve former colonial power interests, and lacked the capital and technology for independent development, and former colonial powers used financial leverage to maintain influence, providing loans with conditions, controlling access to markets, and using international institutions like the IMF and World Bank to shape policies in former colonies. So formal political independence didn't mean economic independence, and in many cases, the wealth extraction that characterized colonial rule continued through financial mechanisms rather than direct political control. And this is sometimes called neocolonialism. And while the term is politically charged, the underlying reality that financial power continues to shape relationships between former colonizers and colonized is well documented. Looking at the British Empire through the lens of loans and gunpowder also helps us understand similar dynamics in other imperial powers. All European empires used some combination of financial leverage and military force. The French, Dutch, Belgian, German, and Portuguese empires all followed similar patterns of using capital borrowed in Europe to finance military operations that secured resources and trade monopolies that generated profits that could repay the loans and fund further expansion. So this wasn't a uniquely British approach. It was a general pattern of how modern empires operated, but Britain was particularly successful at it, partly because of more developed capital markets, partly because of maritime power that enabled global reach, and partly because of willingness to use overwhelming violence when necessary to maintain control. And comparing different empires reveals both common patterns and specific variations that help us understand the general relationship between finance, force, and empire. The moral reckoning with this history is complicated and ongoing. Because the wealth generated by empire still exists, it's been invested and reinvested over generations. It's visible in the infrastructure, institutions, and wealth distributions of former imperial powers. And the poverty and underdevelopment of many former colonies is directly related to the extraction and destruction caused by colonization. So there are real contemporary consequences of this history, but determining what, if anything, should be done about it is contentious. Some argue for reparations, others for development aid with no strings attached, others for structural changes to international financial institutions, and others argue that focusing on historical grievances is counterproductive and that everyone should simply move forward. And these debates are important and unresolved. But what's not debatable is the historical reality that the British Empire was built through systematic extraction financed by loans and enforced by violence, and that this process created wealth in Britain and impoverishment in many colonized territories. The technological and organizational innovations that enabled empire also had broader impacts. The financial instruments developed to fund imperial expansion, like tradable bonds and joint stock companies, became foundations of modern capitalism. The logistics and administrative systems developed to manage far-flung territories influenced modern bureaucracy and business organization. And the communication networks, shipping routes, and trade patterns established by empires shaped economic geography in ways that persist today. So empire's legacy isn't just about wealth transfer. It's also about institutional development and technological change, and disentangling the beneficial innovations from the exploitative context in which they developed is analytically difficult and morally complex. Because you can't simply say that modern financial markets are bad because they originated partly in imperial contexts, but you also can't ignore those origins when trying to understand current structures and inequalities. The role of ordinary British people in this system is also worth considering, because most British workers and farmers weren't directly involved in imperial administration or colonial trade. They were struggling with their own economic difficulties, with industrial exploitation, with poverty and insecurity, but they did benefit indirectly from empire through cheaper imported goods, through employment in industries that processed colonial raw materials or manufactured goods for colonial markets, and through the overall prosperity that empire brought to Britain. And many also believed in the civilizing mission rhetoric, genuinely thinking that British rule benefited colonized peoples. So assigning responsibility is complicated. Imperial policy was made by elites and implemented by colonial administrators and military forces. But the system required broader participation and acceptance from British society, and unpacking these different levels of involvement and responsibility is important for understanding both history and contemporary debates about colonial legacy. In the end, the British Empire was bought with loans and gunpowder in a very literal sense. Every expansion, every conquest, every extracted revenue was financed through borrowing and enforced through violence. And the returns on these investments, which came from controlling trade, extracting resources, and taxing colonized populations, made the empire profitable for British investors and ultimately generated wealth that shaped modern Britain and the modern world. And this process, which lasted for centuries and touched every inhabited continent, created the economic geography we live with today, where former imperial powers are generally wealthy and former colonies are generally poor, where international financial institutions are dominated by former colonizers, and where the structures of global trade and finance still reflect colonial relationships. And understanding this history doesn't mean wallowing in guilt or assigning blame to people living today who didn't create these systems, but it does mean honestly confronting how the modern world was made, acknowledging that contemporary wealth distributions and power relationships have historical roots in systematic exploitation, and recognizing that creating a more just and equitable global economy requires dealing with these legacies, not pretending they don't exist or that they've magically disappeared just because formal colonization ended decades ago. And the story of how the British bought an empire with loans and gunpowder is ultimately a story about the marriage of finance and force, about how capital markets and military power created modern imperialism, and about how the wealth created through this process continues to shape our world in ways both visible and invisible, benefiting some and disadvantaging others based largely on which side of the colonial relationship their ancestors were on. And that's an uncomfortable truth, but truth it remains, and confronting it honestly is the first step toward building a world where wealth and power are distributed more justly, and where the legacies of colonial extraction are finally acknowledged and addressed.